Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I am here with Mark Weaver.
Hey, Jim.
And we are very glad to have you here today. We are doing another in our series of life practices, and we will be doing some mindfulness as well as exploring some different aspects about the new year.
Yeah. It's part of our multi-series video podcast, and just as a quick reminder, the context for our life practices session tonight has to do with our quest to do some things to both educate and apply some of what is the emerging knowledge that's coming out of what is a fascinating age right now in the last 10, 20 years of the convergence of science to help us understand some of our questions about well-being at an individual level, a community level, at a societal level. And tonight we're going to build on that foundation where we started off with a basic principle that we understand, Jim, that our maps for the world don't always correspond with reality, and that those maps, those schemas that we have for understanding ourselves and the world, they evolve over time. We're going to go much deeper into that tonight.
Yes.
One of the other things that we also covered in an earlier Exploring Reality session had to do with the notion of recognizing that we're always looking through the world through lenses. And I coined a phrase actually from a sign I saw traveling in Europe, mind the gap. Let's retain an attitude of curiosity and accepting that we don't know everything and open our minds and hearts. We also talked about the importance of having a consensual way of defining reality and the importance of the scientific method. Mm-hmm. And then immediately after getting into some of the rational part of our brain, talking about scientific method, we went further into quantum theory and how what we've discovered there challenges some of our basic assumptions about reality. That things that we thought were dual in the world sometimes can be collapsed in ways that open up new ways of understanding. We read a very powerful quote from Einstein that it requires a new way of thinking in the world in general. And then lastly, what we're about here is exploring really our deepest questions about well-being. And with that, one of the life practices sessions that we've already had to do with some ways of getting into our center. And Jim, why don't you pick it up from there?
Sounds great, Mark. Thank you. So it is really easy to get pulled in a lot of different directions. We're starting this new year. We've got all sorts of ways to think about what are we going to do with this new year, who we are going to be going forward. And I want us to take just a moment and to come back into the present moment. Because it's interesting, there is actually only the present moment. The past, obviously, is just a memory. The future is something we may plan and scheme about, but real life is only right now. The trick is that because we have memories, because we are able to think about our past, it can haunt us in ways. It can be either positive or negative. We can be caught living and reliving the glory days, the good old days, or it could be fear or shame about things that have happened in the past that we don't seem to get past. And while we're focused on those things, we are not in the present. We are not living and experiencing what's going on right now. And the same is true for the future. If we are living in anxiety about something that's coming up that we don't know how it's going to unfold, or things that we're really excited about because then things are going to be better, then it's not going to be so hard. Those ideas about the future can rob us from the ability to be present as well. So for us to kind of come back into this moment, we want to use our mindfulness techniques where we're going to become as aware as possible of where we are right now. And so there's a couple things we want to do with that. One is we're going to, in a moment, close our eyes, and I'll ring the bell for when we're going to start that process. And we want to start by just noticing our breath. You don't need to try and change it. You don't need to have any kind of special technique. You just want to, in as much detail as you can, notice your breathing. Pay attention to how it feels when it comes in through your nose or through your mouth, and how it feels in your lungs, or are you breathing into your stomach, or are you breathing into your chest, and how it feels when it comes out. While we do this, you're going to be bombarded by other thoughts and other things that are going to try and get you to think about them. You don't have any control over it. That stuff just pops into your head. Don't try to fight it. Just notice that it came and let it go and come back to looking at your breath. We're going to do that for about 5 minutes, and then I'll ring the bell and we'll come back and we'll continue from there. Once you feel ready, you can open your eyes.
I am. I was just sitting here because I was struck by a quote that I found earlier today as I was preparing for our session here tonight. And I think it's a great lead-in to where we are going. This journey that we're on to talk about things like knowledge and rationality and scientific method and what we're learning about the world with, by the way, an assumption built in that it's better to be coherent with reality than to be distant from reality. Huge assumption that we're making. We can have a separate session about that aspect of creativity and how that works in the world. When we talk about well-being, the more aligned with reality, the more coherent we are, the better. And I'd like to read something, a quote from Jean Houston, that helps us capture a little bit of the mystery and passion that goes with what can sound to be a bit of a dry, scientific, or intellectualized exercise. Here it is. There is something else that's trying to come through, that lure of becoming, and it does come from the realm of spirit. And it does come from the realm of the quantum universe. And it does come from the great spark, the Big Bang, that is the threshold of time and history. It is trying to emerge and electrify us. Jim, this is building on what we talked about, that knowledge is emerging. Great philosopher said once, the only truth is that you cannot step in the same river twice, that the only constant is change. I think we're going to go deeper into that concept here tonight.
Yeah. In fact, the same person can't step into the river twice because we are constantly changing as well. And I'm glad you brought up this idea about coherence with reality, because wisdom is really those traditions and those ways of being in the world that help us to understand more about who we are and what our world is like. And those are why those wisdom traditions are important to us, because they help us to navigate the world. They hold up and they stand true when we follow in those paths of wisdom. And we are in times of change. We are at the beginning of a new year, and we do have sometimes anxiety about what the future looks like, even though we try to be focused in the present. So what I would like to do as we're thinking about wisdom and we're thinking about who we are and where we want to go into this new year is have some ways that we can start to think about ourselves that's maybe a little bit different, that might help us to be a little more open to accepting some new things that might be coming down the road, and for how we can manage our own stress level as it comes to things like anxiety about the unknown. So if we think about ourselves, who am I? Can I think of myself apart from my ancestors? This is kind of an interesting thought that I reflect on at some points. If you think about all the decisions that had to be made and all the directions that people chose to go left when they could have gone right and so forth, chance encounters, starting with my parents, but then their parents and their parents, right? I mean, all the way back. Mm-hmm. If all of that didn't unfold exactly the way it did, I would not be here. Can I be considered independent from that? Or the other direction, if we have descendants, can they be who they are without us? Have we not passed on something to them that is also part of us as well and makes us who we are in that time and that experience that we've had? We can also look at other aspects of our world. Can I exist without the sun, without air, without water? kind of strange, don't you think, that we want to think of a person as kind of the self-contained unit, but really we are super dependent on all these other things outside of us that make up who we are and who we have an impact on. Where does that boundary really lie? We could think about, again, this idea of person. Is there any such thing as a person? Because person is a category. You can say this person, but person in general is an idea. It's a concept, right? If I want to say this person, how much of me has to be here for me to be a person? If I had my legs amputated, would I still be a person? My arms? How far could I go and still be a person? What is that definition? The other thing we might think about is, what am I made of? There are trillions of other microbes that are a part of my body. How does that work? I am much more of a colony of things between cells and creatures than I am a single entity. But we find ways to kind of talk about that. We can look at the idea that ultimately we're made up of atoms, but these atoms are the same things that make up this floor, make up the air that we breathe, that are part of stars. How do we define that, right? The reason I'm kind of stepping through this exercise is because I want us to see we have ways of talking about and thinking about the world that are designed to make things a little easier. We can talk about persons and we all know what we're talking about, but the more we kind of dive into it, we realize it's kind of a murky area. It's kind of hard to know where those boundaries are. And we can even think about simple things like, is the neck part of the head or part of the body? What do you think? Is the neck part of the head or part of the body? Yes. We might be tempted to say, no, the neck's part of the body. But then, well, what about the nose and the ears? Why are those considered part of the head and not the neck? It's completely arbitrary, and that's fine. It helps us to have ways, again, of talking about and thinking about and structuring the world. But where we want to be careful is when we take these secondary levels of talking about things, of trying to describe the world, and think that that is, in fact, reality. That the person category is reality, instead of all the other stuff we were just talking about. When we get very convinced that these categories are the reality instead of pointers to the things that are happening behind it, then you might use kind of more of an old-fashioned term, this idea of idolatry, where we've taken this thing and made it what was important instead of what it's pointing to. When we do that, we start to find ourselves in all sorts of trouble, right? Can you think of situations, Mark, where the categories get mistaken for reality?
Mm-hmm. I can think of an example just from today in my practice. I was working with a young man who is getting ready to become a father, and was presenting with some fairly serious depression that was uncharacteristic for him. And after some exploration about what's going on there, we came to understand there's a story that he's carrying around about what parenthood means. And that story has to do with his own parents and how he was raised. Turns out that upbringing was a very painful one and a very difficult one. And we came to understand that he had a great deal of conflict about being a parent. And it had to do with his concept of parenthood and how limited it was. He was not exposed to many good examples. And so the category of parent was so wired into his being that it produced an emotional response. And once we could separate the name out from the actual experience and his uniqueness and choice to accept or to reject that name, that concept of parent from his past, that opened a whole new door.
Yeah. I think that we can see all sorts of examples when we look at, and I'm just speaking from something from a little bit more of my experience, having been a pastor in the Christian tradition for a number of years, thinking about the transitions with the questions about homosexuality, right? There's a category that has been very clearly defined that's taken on a whole lot of meaning, right? That's been challenged. We can think about other things that get challenged, whether in different types of political or religious arenas, where people can get very concerned because these ideas, these concepts, this way of ordering the world, when they get challenged, can leave us feeling like the bottom's been opened up underneath us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we take the time to think through our world and how these categories are helpful, but they're not the reality, and we can see that the reality is far more complicated, far more of a challenge to get a handle on, it can help us to recognize that we can have some room for recognizing that there's things that can be different, things that can change. One of the things that's hard for us, especially as we get older, is change. Right? We're young, we're excited about change, we want to change the world, we want to do everything. As we get older, we're like, no, I'd prefer things to kind of stay in a certain way that I know how they work and I know how to do it. I know even within my other profession where I work as a software engineer, it's such a challenge because it seems like you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and there's a new software language and a new paradigm and everything's changing, and how do you stay on top of it, right?
Or how do I stay on top of which software app or social media tool are my kids using now so that I could have a chance of connecting with them now?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, Facebook, that's so old.
That's so old.
I'm like, what? Yeah, all sorts of change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we deal with this? One of the things we have to realize is that because we have this kind of built-in negativity towards that change, we have to develop ways to be more open to that. Definitely going through these thought exercises helps, but you mentioned something earlier I'd like to come back to. You talked about developing curiosity. I think that is something that is really an important characteristic for people if we're going to continue to be able to grow and to learn. Why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Well, we talk about this in our culture, don't we? Don't we talk about how we see ourselves as we age, how different from our grandchildren? for me, anyway, I'll say. I got a little more gray than you at this point. We're getting ready to have 2 grandchildren, by the way. That's a whole nother story. But we admire and we notice the open-heartedness and the openness of a child's mind, and the way in which the world has not been tied up into neat little packages already, and things are named and locked in. There is such an openness to discovering things in a new way. I'm remembering a young 6-year-old boy coming into a consulting office many years ago from a very rural part of Oklahoma, who, unknown to me, had never tasted a soft drink before. And I, in my wisdom, in the middle of a break in a therapy session with this kid, suggest, let's go get something to drink. And much to his parents' later consternation, I came to discover, I gave him his first soft drink. And what this young boy said to me as he took his first sip was, tastes like my foot went to sleep. And that's such a beautiful example of how we try and describe new experiences in our lives with what we have already named in our experience. And there's something about that playfulness and openness of the child's mind that we hear in our culture, even today. of how much we seek to recover that sense of youth and vitality. And I think that this curiosity is a big part of it. To not feel like we got it already figured out. We just need to settle into these retirement years and just hope we can make it through this presidency or whatever your particular strategy might be.
Right.
Right?
Or, how can we get all these youngsters to get on board?
Yeah.
Get everybody on the same page. Well, it is, I think, a big challenge for us. I know it is for me from time to time. I don't like to discover that I was wrong about something. It happens, and, we can either pretend like it didn't, or we can adjust, right? Somebody was talking, I can't remember, it was one of my professors in graduate school that said the definition of a PhD is somebody who spends the next 10 years of their life defending the mistakes of their dissertation. Right? And when we confront those things, it's like, what do we do with them? Like, I know for myself, I went through a really interesting transition when I had just a pretty negative idea about capitalism because of a number of things that I was looking at from social justice perspective. And I remember reading a book by a neuroscientist that I really admire and like a lot, Steven Pinker. And it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he makes this astounding case for capitalism. And it was documented thoroughly. And I was stuck, right? I mean, I couldn't get away from it. It was in my face. What am I going to do with it, right? The temptation was to, write it off, block it out, and stick with the writers who were saying the stuff that I believed, but I instead chose to really look at how did he get to that conclusion? And ultimately, after going through the book, I think it was probably 3 times, I'm like, this just makes a lot more sense than where I was before. And it caused a change, right? And it wasn't easy, but we have to, hopefully, as we're thinking about this new year and moving forward and how we want to be able to change, these are the kinds of experiences we want to be able to create where we can find ourselves open to those kinds of changes. There's one last part here that I'd like to take us through. Speaking of historic wisdom literature, there's one that some of you may be familiar with and others may not. It's the Tao Te Ching. Anybody heard of this before? This is
We have some heads nodding out there.
Some have, some haven't. This is, it is considered a world religion, although most people would probably consider it more of a philosophy, a life philosophy. There is no deity in Taoism. It's more about how do we live and exist in the world. And sometimes the way that the ancients would talk about things is a little different than we would. And it kind of forces you to stop and wrestle with it and work it out. And so I want to just kind of use this as a little bit of an exercise for how we could look at some ancient wisdom traditions and how they can be still applicable for things that we're looking at today. And we're just going to look at the first chapter, which is quite short, so no fear. I'm just going to read through it first, and then I want to step back and kind of look at it a little bit. It says, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Yet mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. The source is called darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding." I just love this opening. I find myself going back to this frequently. And it might sound kind of a little mysterious and like, what does this exactly mean, Jim? Why do you like this? Let's think about what we talked about earlier and how it might apply to how this lays out. So when it's talking about the Tao, which sometimes is translated as path or way. It's saying that the way that can be told, or the way that you can actually go, is not the eternal way. It's this idea, kind of like when we're talking about the naming of things. We can talk about a person as a person, but the reality is something far more than just the person. So the reality is not the thing that can be named. The named is something different. It's something else. It's not the eternal part. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. This is how we start to think about all the stuff that make up our world, all the things that we can get attached to. So the Lao Tzu, who is the author here, says, free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Manifestations are what we have named, all these particular things. And we get caught up in that, and we desire those things. And we can't see the mystery when we are caught up in desiring and holding on to these named things. But when we're able to let go of that, then we can see the mystery. Yet the mystery and the manifestations both arise from the same source. And that source is darkness. And this ending, darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. That fascinates me. It's this idea, to me, it's like this unknown, this void, that you have to let go of that fear, that anxiety, to enter into it in order to get to that next level of being able to understand.
I'm having a little bit of your experience of reading Steven Pinker's reinterpretation of capitalism, because when I first read a long time ago the word darkness and darkness within darkness, it was a time when I had just lost a family member to death and was feeling great darkness. And I'm noticing the named experience around the concept of darkness initially closes me off. And back then as well, because I was brought up a good Presbyterian, the whole idea of dipping into literature that was other than Christ-centered was also something I had to get past. Long time ago, got past that. And so even in attempting to find the truth and wisdom in this, I notice I'm in that experience of being tempted to hold on to and then invited into, because I'm curious, invited into what this notion means of letting go and being able to let go of what I think is lighting up my light of understanding of the world. I have to be willing to let go of some of that if I am truly to grow in my understanding. I believe that's a biblical phrase even.
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of paradox about being able to let go of what you think you know in order to learn.
Has anybody ever seen, there's a great video, and it went around in some corporate settings many years ago when I did that kind of work. And it's a beautiful video of a kid walking down the beach, and he's got his bucket, and he's filling it with shells and rocks, and he gets it all full, and he's really happy, and he goes down, he sees some really colorful ones, and he's trying to put them in, and he can't get them in there. And he starts to cry, he's so frustrated, and he talks with his dad, and his dad says to him, "Son, you filled up your bucket so full you can't put anything else in there." Which is also a story that's told to illustrate the same point. We fill our heads up and hold on to it.
There's no room for anything.
No room.
Yeah. Well, what I'd like to do for the close of this then is take some time in mindfulness to reflect on that idea of darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Just that idea of darkness as the gateway to understanding. Just take some time and reflect on that. We'll do the bell. Just let it roll. See where it goes. See where it takes you. What kind of things come up in your mind. If it's something that feels uncomfortable, if it's something that feels like you don't want to go there, or if it's something that you really like. And when we come back, we'll have a time of sharing for anybody who feels open to sharing what their experience was.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and get comfortable. I'll go ahead and ring the bells again, and then we'll come back in just a bit.
Actually, I will speak to that because that is an aspect of the darkness. Because whether it's in that particular context or a different one, each one of us, likely in this room, could identify a dark time in our lives. A time when perhaps we thought there was no hope or that we lost something irreplaceable. And if we're fortunate enough to be in a setting, whether it's a minister or a friend or a family member or a spiritual practice, to stay with that experience, sometimes that hitting bottom kind of experience becomes that threshold for learning something new. Because sometimes the pain and the darkness is pointing to the inadequacy and the lack of coherence of the map that we have to understand. As one mother struggled to understand many years ago in conversation with me, her ministers telling her the reason her infant died was that Jesus just wanted her baby with him. That was the interpretation given to her. Many years later, she came to revisit that and decide that that was not the truth of it for her. But But back to the point, even such a dark story evolving into alcoholism and death, this happens in our families, in our communities, in our society. And it should be a trigger for us, whether we're a family member dealing with that or a society learning how to manage the challenges of drugs and alcohol. Anyway, it is a legitimate part of the darkness within the darkness because of the nature of what that portends for us, a future, a rebirth, a recreation out of that darkness.
The unknown.
The unknown.
Yeah. I'd like to also help us remember too that the at least as it's the concept here about the gateway to understanding, it could be that it's this rock bottom experience, but I think it's more the idea of the darkness in terms of the unknown and letting go and facing that darkness, right? That it doesn't have to be because it was something bad that happens in order to try and go into that and understand that darkness too.
Yes, as I said, it's only one aspect of the darkness that can bring us to that.
Well, and I, pulling on my experience within the Christian tradition, it's interesting in thinking about Jesus's role in that he was really challenging people for what they believed at that time to let go of what they thought it was all about, who God was as they understood it up to that point. And, even before that, what was happening with the Hebrews was a serious challenge and change from what people thought previously. One of the encounters that's really hard to understand in the Hebrew Bible is the story with Abraham and the call to sacrifice his son. We're not going to have time to get into breaking that whole thing down, but it's really wrestling with the transition from the time when that was expected or understood as a legitimate form of worship, right? So there's this ongoing kind of this evolution of getting closer to who is God if we're going to think about God. And there's lots of different ways that we can do this because there's, even within a non-specifically theistic worldview, people can think of the divinity sometimes even in terms of like nature, right? Or something like that. But so I'm not being specific here other than there seems to be this ongoing change, this evolution that happens within faith communities where there's this time where it's challenged. The old way of thinking about it has gotten to a point where now it's not helping. It's the category has become the thing we're holding on to instead of the thing the category is pointing to. And we have to be able to let go. And it certainly was very disruptive with Jesus and what happened from there. And I think we're kind of hitting some of that now, where some of that faith tradition is hitting. We talk about a lot of the social changes that are happening and how different faith communities are dealing with those social changes. Some of them are able to let go and others are not, right? What does that mean? How does that look? How do we navigate this? There's no roadmap. It's just things that we have to kind of engage with along the way. And it's kind of, I was listening to a very interesting discussion about a contrast between the idea of belief and faith by a guy, Alan Watts. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this guy, but I think he's a lot of
hippies
fun.
here? Ex-hippies?
But he was saying belief is this idea that you're holding on to something in spite of the evidence, kind of an idea. I'm super paraphrasing here. This isn't exactly how he said it. He said, but faith is something different. He says faith means you're letting go and trusting in something that you have no idea what's coming. And I can see how historically that makes a lot more sense when we think about what the word faith means going back in its original context. It really wasn't this idea about holding on to ideas that are unbelievable It was more about this openness and this trust to go somewhere where you didn't know where it was going to lead, or what does this mean, right? And belief then has kind of changed over the years into this fence that we build around the things that we want to hold on to, and the things that we think that we know, and the things that we're certain about. And faith has kind of been twisted into that. But really, if we think about it more in the sense of how do we have that trust, how do we have that openness to be able to get to more of the truth, then we've got some of the resources, even within our faith traditions, for how we move forward in some of these challenging and dark times, right? Facing that darkness to get to that gateway of understanding. It's interesting to think about that idea of letting go in order to understand, and the challenge that poses for pretty much everybody. Yeah.
Dare I say it? I will. You can edit it out later. But this obviously has tremendous application to what is going on in our culture right now in the United States. I mean, what is a Democrat now? What is a Republican? Are there conservative Republicans anymore? Are all Democrats socialists? And just the way that we carry around those names and the beliefs that we have about division can become an obstacle to even connecting with and talking with each other in a line, at Major Market. And I shared last week, I've had some really eye-opening experiences. If you haven't picked it up, I lean a little bit more on the liberal side of things. But you know what? I have brothers and sisters who seized upon the Trump opportunity because they believed and hoped for something that I also was believing in and hoping for, and that was that the system's broken and it needed to be fixed. And that, trusting that that was an honest claim by President Trump at that time, but I believed at that time that really is something we have in common, no matter what we might call ourselves on the political spectrum. And the sooner we get past those obstacles to being able to talk to each other, whatever parties we might be affiliated with, the sooner that we do that, then the better chance that we have for solving some of these challenges we got.
Well, and we can start with us.
Yeah.
Right?
That's all we can do.
Yeah. We don't have control over how everybody does what they're going to do, but we have the opportunity to really want to understand this idea of wisdom, about that coherence with reality, and how do we get there, and how do we recognize when we're holding on to things that are making it difficult for us to see what is really there, and having that faith, that courage to let go, to go to that next level of understanding. I mean, it's the whole thing is just really fascinating when you think about all the dynamics that are going on. The part maybe I'll just kind of bring this back to, because I think it works well with what you were bringing up. When we had our first session on mindfulness, one of the keys that we wanted to bring up with that is breaking down that kind of response cycle that we have when we experience something. And what we talked about was there's kind of 3 steps to this. There's some kind of an event that we experience. There is our interpretation that happens of that event. What did it mean?
Which often goes unnoticed in the moment, right?
Yes.
That happens real quick.
And then there's our reaction.
Reaction.
And just like you're saying, the reaction is to our interpretation, but we think it's to the event. And so this is like a key thing that we have to do if we want to try and get a handle on how we respond to things, is recognize that middle step that kind of happens almost without thinking about it, but becomes the root of so many challenges in how we respond to things. So by becoming more mindful, more in the present, more aware of what we're actually thinking, what we're actually feeling, not being so distracted by things from the past or the future, but able to be present, we have a chance at kind of interrupting that cycle so that we're not simply reacting to this experience that's been interpreted, but we can respond to the event and notice how we're interpreting it. And that opens up a whole nother doorway for how we can then engage with other people and how we respond to the things that happen to us.
Another way of saying we are not the thoughts that were was going through our mind as we were seeking to just be in the moment, in our bodies, and be who we are now.
Yeah. Right on. All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate you being here, and hope we'll see you next week.
Yay.